Okay, we went ahead and gave everybody a few minutes to join. If people are still trickling in, which I think that they are, we will record the beginning of the conversation and you won't miss a thing. So I am just going to go ahead and start by introducing our awesome experts and speakers and panelists, whatever you want to call them. And then I will push it over to Francis. So Francis is a well-rounded founder as far as the founder for the software analyst cybersecurity research, which means he brings us all things data, research, the unbiased point of view, and he brings the expertise of the cybersecurity industry as a whole, analyzing how our industry is shifting, changing, and evolving in real time. So he's going to present all of the data and give us the context of the conversation we're going to have today. And we also have Paul here, who is a seasoned cybersecurity leader with decades of experience. He's a person who has experience as a practitioner to a CISO, and he is bringing us the practitioner and leader perspective, connecting that data to actions that cybersecurity teams and leaders are taking. And we will be able to have a back and forth conversation with him, as well as asking questions to both of them. And then last but not least, we have Matt Tower from the Entro team as well. He is bringing us the perspective of how this industry is evolving, how people are talking about non-human identities. He also has decades of experience in the cybersecurity world and speaking with all types of people, from practitioners, engineers, founders, analysts, to help solve the problems that everybody faces as far as securing our non-human identities or machine identities. I am Kelsey Purcell. I am on the Entro team, and just a couple of housekeeping. Sorry, Francis, I'm getting some feedback. Just a couple of housekeeping items. The Q&A is open. Please submit your questions. This should be an involved conversation, and we want to hear from you and speak directly to you. The chat should not be used, just so I don't miss anything. But if you need something pressing, feel free to put it in the Q&A box and I will be monitoring that. Okay, Francis, I am going to pass it over to you.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much to the Intro team. And thank you all for having me and welcome anyone wherever you're joining us from. Just really excited to give this presentation on my behalf. And I think from my perspective, I come from a neutral perspective in terms of bringing in the research perspective. And so a lot of these findings are that I'm going to be presenting shortly are all summary discussions of the conversations I have with IAM and identity security leaders, and that we've had over the last few months here. So my goal here is to give almost a mid-2025 update as it relates to non-human identities or machine identities, as depending on what camp you fall on. But more broadly, to talk about this, I think at this point in 2025, I think the reason why we have it as an update is really we believe at this point in time there's nothing new, right, about non-human identities. There's nothing completely new about the risk. There's not a whole lot of new things. This, I feel, for many practitioners who've been following the industry for give or take about a year now or so, we've all heard about the different risks, the importance of non-human identities. And so a big part of these conversation is to really talk about where are we at across that adoption life chain. And that's a big part of what my presentation will be about. So the goal here is to say, okay, from early 2024, I think this time last year, there was a lot of hype, there's a lot of excitement about the role that NHIs play. And throughout that phase of 2024 up until now, what has really changed? I'm not going to speak to every single detail on the slide, but I think at the most part, I think we've seen a lot of new research this year from Okta, Delinea, even CyberArk, some of the big companies showing that initially we had felt that 20 to 1 was maybe the number, and we're seeing new research showing that that number is actually significantly higher due to what's happening with agentic security. So that's one context or baseline that we've seen maybe happen over between last year and say now where we're currently at. For many of you who've maybe followed some of my past research as it relates to the industry, I will still say it still remains a key problem for a lot of enterprises. And this was a prediction that we talked about last year as it being a core problem for CISOs, and that still remains very much more so the case as of now. We're still seeing companies moving into this buy over build trend, and I think we're going to talk about that later on with Paul around what's happening as it relates to how you actually go about solving this problem tactically. Because there was, as of last year, some security leaders felt as though, hey, I have some solutions internally I could use to manage my service accounts. However, we've seen that slightly change. And then unified visibility is another thing I think we're going to talk about later on with Paul. So one of the core, I'll speak through just five major trends again that we've seen throughout this year. Again, the goal isn't to go too deep into them. I'm gonna share the slides and make them available for all of our participants so it's easily accessible. So if we move very fast on things, you will know all the reason is we're gonna share the slides with you, and a lot of the materials here are very easily readable. So I'll just talk at a high level about each of these things. So I will say as of now, June 2025, or give or take mid 2025, I will say the conversation within non-human identity has really shifted to the role that agentic AI and MCPs will play. And I think that's maybe been the biggest change compared to this time last year. I think last year, obviously, there was talk about the role agents will play as it relates, but in my conversations with security leaders, I think a lot of the security leaders that I speak to as well already start thinking, hey, look, now agentic AI seems to be something that's going to be happening much more faster than we had actually expected it. And now we want to actually have visibility into what our agents are actually doing. Again, all of these markets are still relatively early, but a lot of these leaders are thinking about their roadmap over the next 3 years. And obviously MCPs now have increasingly growing in adoption, and many vendors and companies are rolling them out. And so we're seeing a huge huge adoption trend. And I do have lots of data points on here that actually shows leadership from many top leaders are requesting some level of visibility into what agents are actually doing. Because another data set we're seeing in the 96% there is many leaders are gradually getting comfortable with letting agents, tackle somewhat what we would think as maybe high critical tasks, but maybe not security focused, but more around office related type and Microsoft 365. A lot of your core basic productivity enhancements within the enterprise, companies are letting agents do this. And as they think about how we want to actually go about doing that, the next big question they're asking themselves now is what are the security risks, and how do we actually understand what the agents are actually doing? So this is a big trend that has actually happened. I would say also over the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen an increasing number of attacks. And so a number of these increasing attacks that we've actually seen over the last few months have also, again, most of in the slides, you find all the data points for where we get a lot of these data as it relates to all the work we're showing. But a lot of the increasing attacks on non-human identities over the last 8 to 9 months, we're seeing more and more attackers leveraging a lot of these loopholes. It's leading to the calls for detection and response capabilities on the vendor side of things. And so what that means is we're moving gradually away from visibility just being the core driver. Yes, visibility still is the reason, on the 48% there on the right. But what that data actually also showed was companies are getting relatively comfortable with the visibility that they're gradually getting from a number of solutions. And now they're actually emphasizing we need a lot more detection capabilities. We need a lot more DNR capabilities to complement a lot of that same visibility. And so that's new data points that we're increasingly seeing. Another point that we're currently seeing is as it relates to third-party risk. third-party risk, and a lot of how you go about actually managing a lot of your secrets. So this one has to do primarily with the sense of what we're seeing currently on the market today is what we're seeing now is the average time your average credential, takes about 627 days. A lot of credentials are leaving for over 627 days. And think about that. That's how long it's taken a lot of companies. And 70% of NHIs are never really rotated within the set policies that companies are actually putting. And furthermore, 97% of these non-human identities are exposed to external parties and external vendors. And so what you're seeing now are companies are looking for solutions to better help them enhance and manage a lot of this operational nightmare as it relates to how they go about rotating a number of the NHIs. And further towards the right, another new development in this market is the OWASP Top 10 as it relates to a number of the top 10 non-human identity risk. And that was released about a few months to help companies think through some of this risk. Then the last one here I'll just share is the challenge between in-house solutions versus vendor-based solution. I think we're looking forward to our discussion with Paul shortly, where he's going to give us that perspective of, based off my conversations with CISOs as well as security leaders, some leaders are fine with some of the solutions they have in-house that they've maybe built to track and manage a number of their service accounts primarily, or the different API solutions in-house. And a lot of these are being like solutions you stitch together. And I think there's also that whole debate of like, okay, what about actually having a vendor that actually helps you solve all of these problems? And so at an ecosystem more broadly, what we're seeing now is many different vendors and many different providers are racing towards wanting to solve this problem at the intersection. Secret managers, your human identity traditional core vendors, and then obviously you have your pure play NHI vendors and a lot of your cloud DevOps companies. Everyone's racing towards how we actually go about helping to solve this problem. I think many leaders are struggling to decide, do I leverage my in-house solutions? Do I use some of these existing solutions you might already be using internally and complement that? Or do you go for a pure play vendor? Like some of our conversations much later tonight, I think we're going to look forward to Paul to help us on that. I won't talk too much about this, but ephemeral workload certificates and just-in-time secrets is another trend that we're increasingly seeing, and they need to go about managing that. And last but not the least is around discovery posture and remediation. Again, we give a lot of descriptions as it relates to a number of these trends here, and they're very easy to go through. So I'll just wrap that up by just saying across the ecosystem, there are a number of trends we're seeing as it relates to agentic AI, how companies go about actually managing detection and response capabilities to complement a lot of the visibility solutions they have, how they go about managing third-party risk, as well as the whole challenge around sifting through all the different solutions on the market relative to what they have in-house. And then we shared a number of extra complementary trends, which participants could look when we share the slides. So without further ado, I will pass this over to Kelsey, where we will do more of our, where we're talking about the practical implications.
Thank you so much, Francis. Wow, so much information, so little time. Luckily, you are gracious enough to send the slides. There were a couple of points that really resonated and wanted to connect to first Paul's experience, but also I think you said the average NHI life cycle without being rotated is something over 600 days. And there was another data point that Itzik, our co-founder, who unfortunately couldn't join today, he had an emergency referenced from, I think it was an IBM report, where it actually on average takes nearly 300 days for security leaders to find NHI that was involved in a breach or was compromised. So those are some pretty scary stats when we start looking around the data and the potential impact that it can have in real time. Paul, on that note, I would love to hear what was the defining moment, or what was the exact characteristic that you were experiencing that kind of catapulted you into prioritizing NHI security, especially as a CISO, limited budget, limited resources, and needing to secure all of the things?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kelsey and Francis. Great overview on that. So many different data points to really take into consideration. I think when we think about this particular area, right, and just the identity landscape in general, overall, right, really when you see the threat actors and the fraudsters, right, they're not having to break in anymore, right? They're logging in. So think of the identity as the new perimeter. Of course, right, tend to overuse that, but it's really quite true, right? Especially in today's landscape where everything is cloud first and cloud native and heavily reliant upon SaaS applications. The way that we develop and build applications is vastly different from the way we used to do it 10, 15 years ago in a more traditional environment, right? Now we have a lot more agile, a lot more focus on DevOps, right? And building new applications and services that much quicker and faster, right? And that really requires microservices. And we think about identity and the way we need to connect these things is through the non-human identity, right? And for practitioners that have always been really focused on the traditional IAM, right, around your end users, your vendors, your business partners, right, even your privileged accounts and service accounts, the whole realm of non-human identities is something that really hasn't been thought of as much, right? It hasn't been an area of focus really the last, up until more recently, as particular as to an attack vector. So it requires a new approach and a modern way of thinking, right? Of way to protection. And it starts with visibility, right? And kind of knowing and everything what you have out there. And a lot of what it described earlier in terms of, mean time and data discovery is quite common, right? Because of the mass proliferation of so many non-human identities everywhere, right? If you're logging into something, it may or may not look like regular routine behavior, right? So unless you have additional detections and response and capabilities and analytics built into a lot of these areas of focus, it's going to go unnoticed and might go unnoticed until it's too late, certainly.
Absolutely. And I want to lean into the visibility aspect because I think that for people like us who talk about this every day and we're so ingrained in it, it might seem like, of course, obvious we need to know where and what non-human identities we have in order to eventually secure them, create the baseline, understand their behavior, and make sure that we're flagging anything that's abnormal. But I would love to hear from Matt because I think that probably out of all of us, he speaks to the people who are still learning. They're still trying to figure out how to take that first step to securing their NHIs. So they might hear, I saw a couple of stats, 42, 45, or we've even seen upwards of 92 non-human identities for every one person. But that's a jarring number regardless, throughout that scale. So how are people approaching this? What do they need first? What are you hearing from them, from people that you're just now talking to about non-human identity security, and what's their biggest challenge first?
Thank you, Kelsey. And to your point, and Francis, I know you had 46 to 1. And to Kelsey's point, that is, we are seeing a higher number. I was actually at a talk with CyberArk last week, and they were referencing 82 to 1 NHIs to human identities. So the number is big and getting bigger, especially with agentic AI. What I'm seeing is obviously what the problem of people trying to solve is Francis, to your earlier point, I would say somewhat have recently fully opened their eyes and realized, okay, my developers are creating these NHIs. Security really doesn't have oversight. What I say all the time is security is an interesting spot because while they're responsible for what the engineers do at the end of the day and what they put in the code in the company, they're not the direct manager. And really these engineers are able to kind of permission and scatter them at will around the organization. And no one really has visibility or true inventory of where everything is within an organization. So really, I mean, Kelsey, I know you referenced the IBM report. I was going to do the same thing, but I mean, yeah, it's now because I'm speaking to CISOs, heads of IAM or heads of application security every day, they've really grasped onto the problem of, okay, I'm doing this for my 2026 budget. I need to fix this somehow. Can we start a POC? So, but yeah, I'll digress and pass it off to the next person.
The one point to add on that, right? What Matt mentioned, right? When you think about the proliferation of SaaS applications, and when I talk to other peers or other leaders, they may or may not have a really good grasp of their GitHub, right? Identities, right? The way they manage their applications, pipeline tools like Circle C. Right. Everyone remembers they had a massive breach not that long ago. Right. And that's quite an effort to rotate on all those, keys and identities and secrets. And it's from my perspective, I might have one thought where we have like a number X of non-human, but it's really times two, right? When you think about other applications like Jira and Confluence, right? And your public and your private repos, that you have identity sprawl everywhere, right? And that's the reality. So you got to have good visibility. And with that, generally requires some tooling and platforms.
Yeah, you definitely need visibility. First and foremost, to know where everything is. And then once you have that, you need to take it a bit to the next level and understand, okay, when is someone, whether it be internal or external, doing something that is out of band, right? When is a developer taking an NHI and put it on a Confluence page or put it on SharePoint or OneDrive or sharing it on Teams or Slack, or when someone from external from the organization is trying to exploit. So you need both sides of the coin there.
I'd love
And one last thing to add, sorry, okay.
No, go ahead.
go,
Okay.
Francis.
No, just the last thing to add is I think even I just wanted to echo your point as well around just the numbering of non-human identities relative to humans, but I also think in the future of gotta give or take 2 to 3 years as agentic AI matures, what you're gonna have is agents creating other processes and process tools. And that's just think about that replicating process of agents creating their own and leveraging tons of tokens and what that actually, how that significantly increases the vastness of what you need to manage. And so it just speaks to how this problem will only get complex over time.
Absolutely. And I think that the tying it together with the sheer number of NHIs that people have to discover, but also this adoption of agentic AI, the usage of NHIs, especially being in cloud first organizations, the point of it is being able to move at enormous speeds and be able to innovate faster and to do more, be more efficient, and be eventually more successful within the organization itself. So there's going to have to be that happy medium, right, of reclaiming control of these non-human identities while Paul, I'm sure that you can relate to this, but while also encouraging innovation and not wanting to put a stop to it, which I've heard from other CISOs that they want to secure this and they are also a little bit hesitant around putting these blockades in place because they don't want to break anything and they don't want to halt business or accessibility. So I'd love to hear, because Paul, I know that you evaluated NHI solutions, you ended up going with Entro. What was the biggest challenge when you were implementing it or when you were overseeing that take place within the teams? What's the biggest challenge and what advice do you have to other security leaders who are saying, this is a colossal problem, I know it, I hear Francis's data, how do I start beyond just evaluating their environment when I'm putting it into place?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Kelsey. And I think, first and foremost, since this is a rapidly evolving area, right? You got to follow what's the best practice, right? What are your policy standards, recommendations, guidelines as it pertains to NHIs, right? Because you can't treat it like a regular end user, of course, right? And we think about, things like multi-factor authentication, MFA, right? That doesn't really work with NHIs, right? So, we've had a mandate to, to have MFA everywhere, right? That doesn't really help for NHIs, right? So what is the best practice? What's the best recommendation on how to manage it? In terms of evaluating a platform, right? Everything I've always done and always did in current and prior organizations always take a risk-based approach, right? What is it that we're trying to protect at the end of the day? What's our intellectual property, right? Is it our code? Is it our secret sauce, right? Regardless, and how are we protecting that from an ecosystem perspective, right? When it comes to evaluating, tooling and technology in this space, right? We talked briefly about visibility. That's kind of comes first and foremost, but we know, right? Everyone's got a variety of applications and tooling and platforms that they want to integrate, right? From their SIM, from their automation, from their EDRs and MDRs, right? And how does Entro kind of play well into that, right? A lot of our thoughts was, we needed to implement HashiCorp Vault to manage all of our secrets, right? HashiCorp, super popular, very easy to use and implement for cloud native environments, right? So we think about how, and HashiCorp works well with those identities that you know about, right? But how do you identify identities that you don't know about, right? In NHI space, and forced into the HashiCorp Vault, right? So kind of enabling the connector with HashiCorp Entro, a big differentiator, right? And a big capability, right? So those are some of the criteria to look for. Otherwise, easy scanning, easy discovery, and actionable information, right? I know, a lot of organizations are hesitant to give full, access, right, to third-party tools to take action on your behalf, right? A lot of that comes with some kind of level of maturity, right? And kind of organization have been at the kind of maybe more early stage maturity where we're not ready to allow, another platform to take action on our behalf, right? We want to have, an analyst, an engineer, evaluate, right? What is the potential risk, right? What's the timing? What's involved, right? And then make an educated decision on whether getting that, moved over or not, right? Operationally. So I would say there's definitely a maturity and a learning curve for this, right? Depend upon the organization, depend upon your compliance needs, your audit needs, right? So the platform has all the capabilities, right? But you want to take a risk-based approach, based upon your own organization risk tolerance, right? Especially for applications that have, mission critical, right? And require 7x24 uptime, right? So really need to kind of take a risk-based approach, do your evaluation, follow best practices in terms of getting not just evaluation, but also getting implemented, right? In terms of the integrations, and at the end of the day, what it is that we're trying to protect, and is it meaningful, right? Is it working for us?
Could I? One question.
Absolutely.
Just building on that, Paul, I was curious, like, did your organization also face the challenge of, we already have Hashi for our secrets managers, we might have some PAM solution, we might have some other solution in-house, and we might just want to build our own internal processes. Like, how did you wrestle between some of the in-house tools you had, as opposed to then saying, hey, you know what, we actually need a pure play vendor to help us solve this problem?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. So Francis, right? I mean, it's from my vantage point, it's a different tooling, different technology altogether, right? When you think about, privileged account management, whether it's, a CyberArk, a Delinea, or, like a HashiCorp with more of a vault, right? Your secret storage, right? It's a storage repository versus a way of, to discover, right? And identify all of your NHIs. And some might work well just within your cloud, right? Within your cloud environment, whether it's GCP, Azure, or AWS, right? But what about everything else, right? So you see a lot of tooling work in their own silo, right? Doing discovery and analytics within their own kind of domain, right? But really don't have the ability to kind of transcend across multiple platforms and applications, right? That's kind of where I see a lot of the power, right, and capability of Entro, and the ability to kind of integrate and play well with all the other kind of applications earlier mentioned, right? And then provide actionable results with some risk analytics, right? Whether this is critical or high, medium, low, and requires immediate attention, right? So you highlighted earlier around the detection and response capability, right? That's not necessarily the function of a PAM tool, right? That's more of the function of a platform, right? Built specifically around NHI. So that's kind of where I see the differentiator and kind of the landscape continue to evolve, specifically around the detection response capability.
Matt, I'd love to hear your perspective as well, because a couple of things stuck out to me when Paul was talking about how he implemented this with the team and any challenges he ran into. So one thing is we talked about evaluating the current risk. What's our current environment look like? And Matt, I'm sure that you know that we've had some people say, shameless plug, that they spent a month trying to discover their non-human identities. I think they found 10, and then they're like, let's try an Entro assessment. We do them bare bones and offer the free assessment because knowledge is power. And I think they found thousands of non-human identities. So it's the NHIs that you know exist, and then the NHIs that you don't know about, but they are likely out there. So Matt, I'd love to hear the teams that you see most impacted by this. Are there characteristics beyond just cloud first, industry, size? Paul mentioned maturity, so I'd love to get your perspective as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely changed. I would say 6 to 9 months ago, I found myself on calls often and literally explaining to folks what a non-human identity was. And I somewhat joke that folks like Paul had some sort of WhatsApp group chat going and said, "Hey, we need to figure this out. This is an industry-wide problem." It has some massive headwinds behind it. I would say industry-wise, I mean, obviously, to Paul's point, the cloud native and cloud first organizations were definitely first to grasp this, but I find myself in conversations all the time, like over the past week with large big banks and healthcare companies, where in your head you're like, oh well, they're traditionally on-prem, but at the same time they have heavy compliance risk within the organization, and none of them have an inventory of. I mean, they've tried. I mean, I've talked to companies that have taken it in-house and tried to build an in-house product to figure out where all their non-human identities are and where they're living. But it's static, right? It's not constantly scanning and things like that. So you can't store all these in an Excel spreadsheet and attempt to have a inventory and a grasp of who owns what. And to Paul's earlier point, also, when something does go awry and when someone's keeping things in a gold mine on GitHub and has 20 secrets or NHIs in one place or on SharePoint or OneDrive, you need to have that level of visibility and insight into. And then I need to know who in the company is sharing these around when they shouldn't be.
Yeah, I think that one important piece, we could, we mentioned compliance earlier, right? You think about from a regulatory and compliance framework, and compliance is always kind of catching up, right, to the threat landscape in somewhere where I think that's, speaking with others, that some of the compliance frameworks haven't caught up yet or really caught on to this area, right? It's still kind of rapidly evolving, but it's kind of looking to see, does it fit into any particular realm, right? Identity and access management, network, security awareness, right? Or incident response, where does this kind of fit, right? It's still kind of maybe to be determined, at least from my perspective, right? Whether, where's PCI going to really focus on that? You generally have a process for your service accounts, right? And your privilege accounts, right? But this is still somewhat different, somewhat newer, where a lot of compliance frameworks haven't really caught up yet to some of these risks. So that continues to evolve, right? I think we'll see more attention kind of given that, even within your larger, more regulated, hypothetically more mature organizations at some point.
Yeah, it's you'd be surprised. It's funny. I mean, whether it be PCI or NIST or ISO, whatever one of the compliance frameworks, I think most of them nowadays have a key rotation mandate within them, and it's incredible to me how regulators dig in some areas and don't dig into others. But I digress there. But yeah, it's knowing that, okay, you have X amount of keys in the organization that haven't been rotated in years, or not just days, multiple years, and it has access to a critical resource in the organization. That's a risk.
I think that it's interesting in connecting the compliance, because obviously somebody is responsible for continuing to make sure that the organization is adhering to the necessary compliances and regulatory aspects. But we got a question in, and I want to hear Paul's perspective. And then I have a second question coming in that's geared toward Francis. So when we talk about the compliance aspect and also just taking a hold and reclaiming control, who are you seeing, or who on your team is responsible for managing these NHIs? And once they're discovered and we do have the detection and response, how critical was that for them to be able to take that on as a team while also continuing to secure and do their other jobs and responsibilities?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? I mean, Originally, I had this kind of slotted within identity and access management, right? Identity and access management architect, right? In terms of the traditional landscape. Now, in terms of, cloud first and cloud native organizations, right? The way I've kind of worked with it, the ones that actually taken actions are your infrastructure team, your SRE, your engineering, right? Your DevOps engineers. Those are the ones that actually kind of own the action at the end of the day, right? And we need to work and collaborate with those staff to actually take action, right, and remediate and address. So I see it truly as a joint ownership at the end of the day, right? I see as a cybersecurity leader, I need to have full visibility. I need to have metrics. I need to have my dashboards and be able to identify risk, right? But I'm going to need to partner with my operations teams, my engineering, my developers as well, right? Whether it's something to identify in QA or production or other environments, right? You need you need an all hands-on approach at some point, right? And if you don't have good policies and standards, you may have different ways to remediate as well too, right? So kind of falling back on your basics, right? So make sure we have what is a desired way to remediate, whether it's a vault, whether it's rotation, right? And having good visibility, it's going to require a joint effort at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I think that adds to the efficiency part of it too, right? Even if you're starting this and you have thousands of non-human identities and you're looking to take control back, it's going to be a huge endeavor in the beginning, and processes put in place so developers are using better practices and not over permissioning or sharing within hard-coded aspects or putting their secrets and API keys through Slack. It's important to put those processes in place so it's not a problem that continues to grow and be out of hand for the team. So I really like that you said a couple of things that I've heard come up before, which is go back to the basics. And also, this is a combined effort, right? The security teams can identify and help mitigate the risks around non-human identities. However, developers and engineers, we need to have a process in place so we are not sharing secrets and API keys in insecure ways. We're not having the over-permissioned aspects if it's not necessary. And that's part of the detection and response aspect where we say, okay, what's the baseline behavior that we expect? Because we want to use these non-human identities. What's the baseline behavior from them? And do we need to flag this or do we not need to flag this? Is this what we expect, or is somebody from a country that we don't even do business with trying to access this API key with sensitive information in it? Okay, Francis, the question that is coming through for you is, how are you seeing this data shift as you do your research, as you analyze and speak to, dozens and dozens of different experts and organizations and solutions and founders? How are you seeing the data shift, especially over the last, 6-ish months, from what they are looking for in NHI solutions? What are they focused on? Is it, hey, this is a problem, we need to solve it? But are they focused more on the discovery aspect? Are there other elements from NHI solutions that they really need? And is there a better understanding from what you've collected to secret scanners versus a full-fledged, NHI security solution? What are you hearing and discovering out there?
Yeah, for sure. I will say yes. So I will say definitely if you take us to early part of 24, it was, oh my gosh, obviously I think everyone had this whole thing of just an awareness of non-human identities. A bunch of companies really popped out and increasingly just really became the talk of the town at RSC, and a lot of people were just like, okay, we gotta get a whole grasp, a good grasp at this. I think back half of last year, a number of the vendors, obviously like Entro, had to do a lot of education, market education, to just really help leaders, help the market really understand what are the kinds of threats that you could be exposed to, what are the risks that you could be exposed to, and even just highlighting a number of risks. And at that point, I would say you started to get some appetite from some forward-looking CISOs, I would say more forward-looking CISOs who are like, you know what, like this is actually a real risk. I should be putting some budget around this. And I think you ended last year with a case of like many didn't have the budget last year and were like, okay, we're going to put this into 25 as like something we got to do. And I think coming into 25, you know, visibility was the number one use case. Inventory, we just need to have some, I think Paul has highlighted this a number of times. That's the number one capability we want. A vendor that actually just give us that centralized visibilities of all the different types of energizing cloud, on-prem, as well as different SaaS environment. So visibility inventory still remains the core use case. And I think you still have some leaders who, and I think this is the challenge though, many leaders do acknowledge, I think the numbers are like close to higher 90%. There's no one who you wouldn't, but when you actually say, how you actually putting money, are you actually putting initiators and project actually behind this? You start to see a little bit of, the numbers obviously get down, but I think that number is growing up as more leaders and their boards and their executives really understand the huge need. To the last half of the question of like, what are we seeing now? I think a lot of leaders who adopted solutions last year, you know, and I would love to hear from Paul. I think they're moving away from inventory and visibility now to, okay, what are the other use cases you could actually really help me? So ownership, assigning of ownership, attribution, like who are the human owners and how are you making sure you're talking to my Okta and being able to attribute ownership. I think detection and response, I think even Paul acknowledged, mentioned that as well. I think how we actually go about rotating secrets in an automated way across all of our different, how do we move to a world of short-lived credentials? I think those are some of the features now that are increasingly becoming important. But I think Paul had something to add here.
I would say, you know, on, you know, definitely taking a risk-based approach, you know, to that, you know, when it comes to, you know, some of the short-lived identity, think about, you know, crawl, walk, run, that's definitely a higher, more mature way to get there, right? You know, when I think about organizations that are maybe ripe for this type of technology and platform, right? We think about, you know, digital transformation and business transformation, right? Those organizations, regardless of their vertical and size, right, that are experiencing, you know, the shift and move to the cloud, right? That at a point, right, is inherently when you need to start to look at, you know, is an NHI solution appropriate, right, for my organization, right? And you think about the, you know, the rapid adoption and utilization of SaaS, right, as well too, right? So it kind of goes hand in hand. We already identified that, you know, organizations that are, you know, do have a number of NHIs that may or may not be aware of, right? But if they're exploring and kind of undergoing any kind of digital transformation or migration to the cloud, right, you really need to stay ahead of that. And that's where you really need to kind of focus on your NHIs, right? Because you're going to have them whether you like them or not, right? And that's regardless of your vertical, your shape and size of your organization, right? So it kind of goes hand in hand from my perspective, right? And you want to get ahead of it before it becomes more of a problem, right? Because we know a number of the breaches and the incidents are all kind of taking advantage of non-human identities in various different locations and applications, right? So this is going to be only a bigger problem as we move on.
Absolutely. And I think we're seeing it's one of the most common breaches, which of course is, if people don't know, it's actually how Entro started. Our co-founder Itzik was breached by a non-human identity multiple times, and it happened in multiple different industries from when he was at Microsoft and also the CISO of a major healthcare organization. So now I think it's the most common or the second most common and the most costly type of breach. But I want to go back to a couple of points and pull in Matt's perspective as well, because we talked about the speed, the digital transformation era, especially, you know, in the last few years and the exponential growth. When we look at that, we say, okay, our people are still humans and they're such a critical element of our teams, and they're expected to sometimes work at machine speeds. And so I want to hone in on the importance of the detection and response, because we have to sleep and eat, and there are human elements involved here. So we can't possibly be 24/7, 365 detection and response. And how critical and how important is it for the automation aspect that Francis talked about? This evolution of, hey, we just need to know where our NHIs are and what's happening, to, all right, now that we know, what do we do with that information? And how can we automate it so there is a level of efficiency and we don't have to have people, at the helm every second of every day, because within minutes somebody can breach and it can be detrimental.
Yeah, so to that point, you obviously need a solution. Obviously, I'm slightly biased working for Entro, but you need, regardless of solution, you need the ability to, first and foremost, as a security leader, you have dozens of tools, right? You can't be clicking around, just monitoring it every single day. You need that solution to automatically send out, whether it be a Jira or a ServiceNow ticket to the individual owner, a Slack or Teams message, an email, what have you. So when something is critical, the stuff that's low priority, listen, to everyone's point, there's only so many hours in the day. Let's not worry about that, right? But stuff that is high and critical, you need to have a policy in place or just things in place to automatically send out remediation, and working with some sort of platform to automatically then rotate the given key to take it out, right? So once it's rotated, obviously that older key, it has no longer has access to the environment. So you do need those kind of checks and balances in place to move forward. But like I said, security teams have dozens of tools. They need them all to speak to one another. So to help you actually be the most efficient in your organization to actually get things done. And to that earlier point, it actually did surpass phishing. It is the most frequent attack vector now. That's from the Verizon report, I think the IBM report as well. The bad guys have caught on to this. People need to figure out how they're going to fix this. Bad guys have realized that these are scattered organizations and they are over permissioned. And once they get a hold of one, it's I don't want to say game over, but it's pretty hellish to work out who owns it, what it's plugging into, and what is the kind of attack path. So
Yeah, I think that the data speaks to that as well, right? We have the data to show that not only does it take 300 days almost to detect them, then you have to remediate. Then you have to understand, did the bad actor move laterally within the organization? Did they try to find a non-human identity that had more permissions to more sensitive information? And being able to not only identify that, but the lineage between access point, the lineage between non-human identities to human identities. And it really is unnecessary within an organization to continue to build, evolve, innovate, but also it's necessary to have the checks and balances in place. So we have a couple more minutes left. I would love to open it to Paul and Francis. Add any last minute thoughts, ideas, and action items, takeaways that people can use all this great information and run with it at the speed of light, hopefully.
Yeah, I can chime in on that, right? So I would say, for anyone or any organization looking to, better understand, what their risk posture is, definitely do some kind of assessment, right? Do a POC, do a POV, identify what are your, critical applications and cloud infrastructure, and start there, right? There's really no need to boil the ocean, right, so to speak, right? You can take a risk-based approach, right? We talked about some of the communication tools, like Slack and Jira and Confluence and GitHub, right? Have a good starting point, right, as to where you really feel you maybe have an exposure, right? And run a risk assessment. And that's a good way to kind of, evaluate, right, different tooling and different platforms, right? And if you don't think it's a risk at all, well, maybe do a pen test, do a red team exercise, right? Bring in an outside third party, firm or organization to evaluate, right? Help you kind of hold your hand if you feel you may or may not have enough expertise to kind of come to some determination, right? There is expertise out there, right, to kind of help provide a perspective and provide you with actionable, real-time data and recommendations as an output. So that's something I would highly recommend, regardless of the organization size and scope.
Yeah, no, just I think Paul really hit it on the nail. I mean, yes, do an assessment, obviously understand your risk internally, then do some assessment with a number of solutions out there. I think the benefits of just having one solution that just centralizes and gives you that unified visibility overweighs a lot of like stitching a number of other solutions internally. So that would just be based on what our findings. And I do think this is especially for forward-looking leaders, because I think the pace at which AI is evolving and moving quite fast, it's faster than any other technology that we've had. And I think the biggest risk point will be around identity and a lot of these new identities within the enterprise. So I think for leaders, I think it's an onus to start thinking about, for many, if you're a vendor who doesn't have a solution yet in place, start to look at solutions, because the pace at which things are moving at, you want to be ahead of it. And yes, I think we all have different research solutions and we're all easily accessible if you have questions on the ecosystem at all.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm going to wrap this up with saying that I completely agree with those sentiments. And Paul's point earlier, getting ahead of this problem, it's only going to get worse. It's kind of like it can't be ignored. And I'm paraphrasing, apologies, Paul, but it can't be ignored. And the number of non-human identities and the potential risk factors only going to continue to grow. And the solutions being purposeful in securing non-human identities and letting the solutions that were doing what they were created to do and working on that instead of trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. NHIs are not a new problem, and we know that they've been around for a while. However, the digital transformation growth, the growth of agentic AI, this is all impacting it. Knowledge is power. We want to feel empowered in how we secure our environments and taking a look at those environments as well. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I especially want to thank Francis, Paul, and Matt for the wonderful discussion, the great expertise, and helping other people keep the world more secure. That's why we do what we do, and it's really important. So we will be sending out slides, additional information, and how to stay connected with our wonderful panelists today. If you want to stay connected with me, I am not an expert to that degree, but I do bring the fun and sometimes funny. So you're welcome to connect with me as well. Thank you, everyone.